Hello and welcome to IQT Explains, a series on the IQT podcast where we explore tech trends and their impact on national security. I'm your host, AJ Bertone, and today we're going to explore a very hot topic in the venture capital world right now from what I think will be a very interesting perspective, and that is talking about defense tech with the president and CEO of the National Venture Capital Association, Bobby Franklin. By way of brief introduction of Bobby and the NVCA represents the definitive voice of the U.S. venture capital ecosystem. Under Bobby's leadership, the NVCA is bridging the gap between Silicon Valley and Washington, D.C. to shape policies that fuel innovation and ensure that the capital that's supporting tomorrow's innovations has a seat at the table. Bobby, personally, you bring decades of experience to the role. You've spent years operating at this nexus of technology and public policy, and you also have many years in private industry. It's really a pleasure to have you here for this conversation today.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
I thought we might just start off for those less familiar with the NVCA, maybe just before we get into the defense tech part of the conversation, just say a little bit about, what the NVCA does, a little bit of what you're focused on, who your stakeholders and constituents are, and the outcomes you're trying to drive.
Absolutely. So NVCA was created in 1973, back when the industry was first getting started. And when I say the industry, I mean the venture industry was really developed here in the United States. And it's something other countries have tried to emulate. And what we do at NVCA are basically lobbyists. I like to say we're lobbyists for the entrepreneurial ecosystem. Even though venture firms are our members, our agenda is really much about public policy that helps the startup community.
That's great. So let's just maybe get right into it. I'll maybe give a bit of a scene setter. I'd argue that we are living through one of the most significant or consequential shifts in defense technology in decades. Emerging technology across so many domains is evolving, advancing at breakneck speed, and especially given the current geopolitical climate, conflict all over the globe, the U.S. government is having to rethink its approach to modern security in this new technological age. Related to that, we're seeing entrepreneurs popping up to start defense-first or heavily defense-oriented businesses in spaces that have long been dominated by the primes. We're seeing venture capital at all kind of levels of the stack, pre-seed to growth, tier one VCs in particular leaning in to support these companies. And from that, you've got Silicon Valley wanting to engage DC, the executive and legislative branches, in ways that we've never seen before. So maybe just on that point, specific to defense tech, what are you seeing? What are you hearing from your venture ecosystem stakeholders, particularly when it comes to defense technologies and national security technologies?
Yeah, basically we're seeing a huge influx, as you said. We're seeing a lot more dollars. We're seeing a lot more interest. We're seeing a lot more engagement. For the public watching the conflicts play out across the globe, they see it too.
Yeah.
They see a non-traditional, conflict setting. They see the warfighter sort of facing drones and things, and that's just unlike anything that we have known in past conflicts, right? And so it's a very different scene, and I think the entrepreneurial ecosystem is best equipped to provide the warfighter with what they need.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there certain things in particular that VCs are asking you to lean into, or things that might be unique to national security technologies, maybe that policymakers, I don't want to say don't understand. There's maybe an opportunity to educate them a little bit more.
You can say that. I tell them that all the time. Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, if what is being built, the most innovative products to help the warfighter, if those aren't put in the warfighter's hands, then nothing happens, right? And so what we are doing is at that intersection of public policy and innovation. Let me give you a broad sense, and then we'll go back to maybe the Pentagon in particular. In a broad sense, Washington and policymakers have a great understanding of what's important to Fortune 500 companies.
Yeah.
And in many respects, they're, in their ears every single day talking about what they need, what they want. And, I spent a decade or more in the telecom industry. I was very much a part of that world where incumbents or primes in other industries were dominating the conversation with policymakers. And it's really hard to break through that noise. And so part of the reason for NVCA to exist is to make sure we're educating policymakers about, hey, wait a minute, you need to understand where innovation happens. By the way, you need to appreciate and understand that the entrepreneurial ecosystem backed by venture capitalists is essentially the R&D arm of everything, every industry. I mean, as we started, NVCA represents everybody. And when you think about, for example, biotech, 62% of the nation's drugs are approved each year by the FDA, according to one study, that are small venture-backed companies.
Yeah, that's incredible.
It's not the big pharma that has an R&D lab. There is no, Bell Labs like there used to be in telecom. And so everything that's happening is happening with entrepreneurs innovating and venture capitalists supporting them. And policymakers need to understand and appreciate that. And because they're so small, they don't have big Washington offices. They don't have legions of lobbyists and consultants in their ear every time. Now, you pointed out it's getting better. And sometimes the investor has to take on that role and come to Washington and make sure that everybody understands. And then when you start to look in national security, defense tech, et cetera, you see that more and more today.
Yeah, I can't tell you how important the role is that you all are playing in laying the track and providing some of that early education. The venture ecosystem, the startups are starting to get wise on what are the things that we need to do into resource. The defense first or the defense only companies in particular, from the outset, they're thinking about government relations team or, what's our Hill engagement strategy going to look like? That is a very new thing, but that's still a very small percentage of the venture capital ecosystem or the venture-backed startups that have defense or national security relevant technologies. So, vitally important that you're out there providing this education because, as you said, the startups, they're just so resource constrained. They don't have the ability to fund it themselves. And critically, they don't have the access.
Yeah.
We often joke at IQT, you might have a great idea for some technology that you built. You can't exactly just show up and knock on their door and say, hey, can you, take a look at this? I built something neat. It's that access that's often a challenge just as much as the resource constraint.
Well, and then not only the access, then you have to look at how three-letter agencies and others sort of acquire things, right?
Yep.
And what are their processes? And you sort of get back to that old adage about, back in the old days, nobody got fired for hiring IBM, right? And inside a lot of these three-letter agencies, nobody gets fired for hiring a big prime.
Yeah, let's come back. Yeah,
I'll come back to that.
Let's come back to that. I wanted to play off of you. That was a really great stat, in the bio world and the contribution that the venture-backed companies are making. When people say defense tech, that means a lot of things. A lot of people, their mind, immediately goes to, military technologies, weapon systems, and that's not wrong. But there's a whole nother set of national security, what I think of as kind of national security enabling technologies, the infrastructure stuff. I was reading a defense tech newsletter earlier today, and they were talking about how factories are sexy again, right? Manufacturing is a thing. I'm curious, what's your perspective on some of these other enabling technologies that are going to allow this defense tech ecosystem really to thrive and to scale? Are there things that you're working on in that area as well?
Absolutely. So just on defense tech, we've seen from 24 to 25, almost a doubling of the investment. In 24, it was $27 billion. In 25, it was $49 billion, like an 80% increase. That's defense tech. But to your point in your question, thinking about what's happening around that, think about all of the AI that's needed. Think about all the energy. That's the topic of conversation and debate. Capitol Hill is faced with that right now. What's happening to electricity rates, and are the big hyperscalers to blame for it? Things like that. So things like nuclear energy have seen a massive increase. In 2023, there was $200 million venture capital dollars invested in nuclear. Last year, there was $14 billion. I mean, that's a 70x increase in VC talking about nuclear energy and some of the challenges. Cyber investment increased 117% just over from 24 to 25. It went from 9.5 billion to 20.7 billion just in 1 year. Space tech rebounded. There was an increase of 54% from 2024 to 25, went from 7.8 billion up to 12 billion. So it's like not only the, kind of the weapons and the things like that, but it's a lot of things that it's around it.
It's incredible how much, private capital is flowing towards some of these companies and some of these categories. but still so much that will be required, right? Which is super, yeah.
And let me just point out that one of the challenges with a lot of those dollars, once you kind of peel back the onion, you recognize that a lot of that's getting concentrated into just a few companies. So you look at the G round of Anduril. I mean, it was huge, and it kind of reset the scale. It made the sort of median of what's going in like quadruple.
Yeah.
It's great that there's a lot of capital going in. I think one of the untold stories is how it's getting more concentrated, and that can become a problem. And we see that across the board in venture capital these days. It's hard to raise funds for so many check writers, and those funds that are getting raised are, mostly going into AI.
Yeah, this is an interesting point, and there's definitely a debate that could be had about should the government pick winners. It seems like the current administration is going towards we want at least two options,
right,
on the table. In the venture capital world, it's a risk business, so not every company should succeed, right? But just kind of to the point of capital availability, this is an area that IQT has been thinking a lot about over the past years in some of these areas like critical minerals, for example. You talked about nuclear technologies. This is a place where we've made several investments. And part of our thesis was like our country, these technologies are in the national interest and potentially are not going to be able to attract the requisite capital to get to that inflection point, to achieve that escape velocity. And so we've been making selectively investments in some of these areas to help these companies get off the ground. Really important to make them more attractive to mainstream VC. And then hopefully they get to a point where policymakers in the broader ecosystem see them as attractive bets to make. And there are other things from a public sector funding perspective that we're going to support them to the point where they can serve the government longer term. So anyway.
There's got to be a meeting in the middle,
Yeah.
right? And so a couple of the policy issues we worked on over the past couple of years. Certainly the NDAA had some provisions in there to help with some of the acquisition reform, things like that. Some of the things inside the Pentagon that the Secretary and others are doing are focused on trying to, kind of find ways to purchase either off the shelf or make it easier instead of going through the entire, federal acquisition register processes that haven't changed in decades that the primes know how to, kind of dominate. And so there's this end, but then there's the other end. Like how does the government reach down and make it easy? That valley of death between SBIR and kind of what's happening.
Yeah, program of record or something. Yeah.
Is very difficult.
Yeah.
And then you couple that with the challenge that SBIR reauthorization had. We're taping this. It's made it through the Senate. We hope it makes it through the House very, very quickly. And, those are areas that are trying to kind of make a difference and trying to help bridge that gap, but they each have their own challenges. I mean, part of the reason that the whole reauthorization was held up was because there is this notion that there are these mills out there.
Yeah.
And that a lot of money goes into this, but if you actually look at the kind of those that get SBIR funding, at the end of the day, many of those don't make it to ultimate funding.
Yeah.
Now, to the point about risk and how not every company should make it, I do think we have to appreciate that, right? I mean, a failure rate of a certain level is not a bad thing.
Yeah, not a failure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It means that we, in the innovation ecosystem, are taking risks. Mm-hmm. And I often cite a study when I go up to Capitol Hill. One study looked at all venture investments over a 10-year period, and 75% of them failed. And that's okay.
Yeah.
And, at first people look at me like, you're celebrating failure? And it's like, well, a lot of countries don't. And therefore, they don't take enough risk. They don't push the envelope. At least we have that in our culture, and that helps us.
Yeah, you got to have this reframing of it's the cost of innovation.
Absolutely.
Right? And you need the failures to have the breakout successes.
Yeah.
This is something that I wanted to come back to, and I think you're hitting on it. But there's policy and there's practice. And as you said, over the past couple years in particular, it seems like the policy landscape is changing. But at the end of the day, that policy, people have to put that policy into practice in some way, shape, or form. And there's risk aversion, and you're not exactly rewarded for taking risk in some places in government. I'm curious, are there other things you're seeing, areas that are getting traction when it comes to putting the policy into action perspective? Or maybe if that's, less of your purview, are there areas where new policies are getting traction?
the ones that have been announced inside the Pentagon are really interesting. And if I go back and look over the last, call it decade, I won't get the years exactly right, but there have been so many positive steps, right? From the creation of DIU, from the Office of Strategic Capital, from all of these things are helpful, moving the aircraft carrier in the right direction, right? But it takes a lot of them, because this stuff has been so entrenched by so many people for so long. And I think we're at that inflection point where now you see the capital that's there, right? I mean, we just doubled in a year. When you look at the amount of capital that has gone into maybe the top 100 companies that are on the list that the Pentagon cares about, a lot's gone in, but not much has been, at the end of the day, contracted.
Yeah.
And so I feel like on the private sector side, like it's not a capital problem right now. There's an acquisition problem. That's what's got to be sort of changed.
We're hearing from that from our portfolio as well. And I think it's not a dirty secret, but a lot of people around DC and also in Silicon Valley are talking about that. When are these companies going to convert to programs of record? And Anduril's a darling. We're early investors, companies like Palantir as well. Like those have definitely achieved escape velocity, but there are a lot of other companies where there have been policy efforts, there have been app fits, there have been pushes for SBIRs and other types of engagements, but when are those companies actually going to cross, that valley of death? And it's really important that starts to happen, right? Because venture is inherently cyclical,
right?
And this is a moment. How long is it going to last? It could be years. It could be a decade. I tend to be an optimist, like in this regard, but those successes in kind of getting to program of record or that enduring, revenue relationship, it does need to happen. Otherwise, VCs are going to put their dollars in other places, right?
I love you saying you're an optimist. It's like, I haven't met a VC that's not an optimist. You have to be in this business, right? And it's amazing just to stop and think about. I talked about that study saying 75% of the investments fail.
Yeah.
It's like, but every time you write a check, you think it's going to be successful.
Yeah.
So you have to be optimistic.
The ones that are successful are so successful that it makes it all worth it, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, well, this is maybe a good segue to, just looking ahead.
Yeah.
There's some good stuff that's happening right now, but I was kind of thinking about this. There's really no end state for your business, right? There's always something that you're going to be working on, right? Looking forward the next 12 to 24 months or whatever the right time horizon is, where are your eyes for the NVCA looking forward on this topic?
When you step back up and you think about what I call the horizontal issues that touch all venture investors, there's always tax issues that comes up. There was the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill last year. There were a lot of provisions in there that really make a difference about how we have more check writers being able to raise funds to support the entrepreneurs that are leading to these great innovations. And so when you look at the business model of venture investing, there's so many things that Washington does that can impact that in a negative way, sometimes in a positive way. And we were able to get some positive things in the Big Beautiful Bill, the tax bill. But, the regulatory environment around fund formation and the changes that have been made over the last several years. I mean, we had to take the Securities and Exchange Commission to court. And
the NVCA did.
We did, along with others, but we had a lawsuit in federal court and won and knocked out what was called the private funds rulemaking. And it would have greatly micromanaged the relationship between limited partners and general partners, which would have hindered sort of capital formation. Now we're working on the Invest Act, trying to get that through. We got it through the House. We need to get it through the Senate, but it would help take out some of the regulatory underbrush. Now that there's more private capital that we've just been talking about, one of the challenges is companies staying private longer. There is a negative connotation towards venture funds if they enjoy the venture exemption that was put in place years ago, and they don't want to have to become a registered investment advisor. And in there's a 20% bucket of non-qualifying investments, and secondaries, which is an increasing part kind of the venture landscape, fill up that bucket. And so there's legislation to take it from 20% up to 49.5%. And we had bipartisan support in the House to get that through. Now we need to get it through the Senate. But that's an example of one small issue that hurts capital formation for check writers.
Totally, yeah. And for, to the outsider, such a nuanced point that can have such a massive effect on the way that private capital behaves and is incented. And at the end of the day, venture capital firms exist to generate returns for their investors, and they're going to act accordingly, right?
Well, and one thing you said I think is important to double click on, which is you don't know when these cycles are going to go away. Yeah. So for areas of focus that IQT has and kind of defense tech, there is this moment where the private capital is there supporting you. Mm-hmm. So now is the moment to make sure the government and the acquisition changes so that we can make sure these two things meet and help those entrepreneurs, which ultimately helps the warfighter.
Couldn't agree more. It's a very busy time for us. We're trying to deploy as much capital as we can into many of these defense-first businesses and national security-oriented businesses to help them get to a position where their tech is helping the warfighter, the analyst, whoever might be operating in the IC. And conversely, then the national security community is helping those companies from an income statement perspective. And it's really going to be, the next couple of years in particular, I think a formative time for us. It's been a great conversation. Really a pleasure chatting with you and hearing more about how the NVCA has been working to bolster this vitally important ecosystem. Thanks very much for being here, Bobby.
Thanks for having me. It's a very important topic to bring to life.
Well, thanks for listening to this episode of IQT Explains, a series on the IQT podcast. Subscribe for more, leave us a review, and visit IQT.org to learn how tech is shaping national security.